If the year 2020 was a sound, it would be this. Yes, folks, I for one am glad that cursed year is behind us, and I know we face a lot of the same problems in 2021 that we had in 2020, but I'm remaining hopeful that reverse bell curve will trend upward by year's end. Before I announce my top 16 worst things about wrestling in 2020, please know I did not list COVID on here by itself. I mean, that goes without saying, and Lord knows it's linked to enough things on this list. I did not need to pad this countdown. Let's begin. Number 16, the Rey Mysterio-Seth Rollins feud. This storyline, quite possibly the longest lasting one in WWE this past year, was an exercise in patience and even occasionally stretched the limits of good taste. The feud began innocently enough when Seth Rollins gouged out Rey Mysterio's eye on the steel steps. From there, the two met at Extreme Rules in the infamous eye for an eye match. No one really knew what to expect with this one, and when it finally happened, a lot of fans were bemused? Disappointed? You'd think that would be the end of it, but somehow this angle kept moving along, now incorporating a young Dominic Mysterio as a wrestler, who at least looked impressive in his first few matches. But we weren't done there, folks. After the whole storyline jumped ship from Raw to SmackDown, suddenly we began to see a budding romance between Seth's lackey Murphy and Rey's 19-year-old daughter Aaliyah, because that's obviously what this angle needed, as Murph would eventually rebuke his Messiah and be brought into the Mysterio family. We got some good matches out of this thing, and like I said, Dominic looked very impressive, but the angle went on for way too long and went in way too many directions for it to be remotely enjoyable by the end. Number 15, Raw Underground. By the summer, it was clear that WWE was not doing enough to keep viewers invested on Monday Night Raw. So what do? The same thing anyone would do in that situation. Start a fight club. Back in August, we were introduced to a brand new concept called Raw Underground. It was a place where lesser used wrestlers and unknown developmental guys could get some exposure with worked MMA fights in a ring with no ropes. Unlike 1998's Brawl for All, this wasn't presented as a real fight mixed in with all the work stuff in the main ring, but rather a place with different rules than the more traditional fare. It wasn't nearly as bad or damaging to the illusion of wrestling as the Brawl for All, but they did share a common trait, in that both of them lost their luster after roughly the first episode. At least the Brawl for All had stakes, like a cash prize and the chance to get eaten alive by Butterbean at WrestleMania, but Raw Underground went on for weeks with no explanation as to its purpose or what the people were fighting for. Unfortunately for fans of real-looking fake fights, these bouts failed to move the needle for Raw. They lived in their own little island and made no impact on the rest of the show until the segment was quietly retired, as sudden and without explanation as when it first arrived. Oh well, not every pandemic experiment's gonna pay off, I guess. Number 14, WWE still hates tag teams. Heavy Machinery, The New Day, Andrade and Angel Garza, Seth Rollins and Murphy, Sasha and Bayley, Alexa and Nikki, The Iconics, Fire and Desire, The Kabuki Warriors. Need I go on? Number 13, Lana versus the Tables. What happens when you take someone who was called every name in the book this time last year and try to make her a sympathetic babyface with little to no change in her character? You get booking magic. Lana had a very up and down year. After months of WWE carrying on with the agonizing angle between herself, Rusev, and Bobby Lashley, the on-air marriage went nowhere, and by the spring it all fell apart when MVP convinced Lashley to get a divorce. After a brief pairing with Natalya that also went nowhere, Lana became a weekly victim to Nia Jax and all those slams through the announce table. If you can believe it, this was part of the company's plan to turn Lana into a big old babyface. Sure, I've seen turns happen over less. By standing on the apron and doing nothing, Lana became Team Raw's sole survivor at the Survivor Series and actually began to show potential in the ring. By TLC, I was finally coming around to her push, but then she was taken off the show with an injury, replaced by a returning Charlotte Flair as she and Asuka won the women's tag titles. If Lana's injury is legit, then it's bad timing. But if it isn't, it's bad writing. After all the suffering fans went through this past year, after all the table spots and the surprise wins at Survivor Series, how are we not going to get a proper payoff to this storyline? How much longer do we have to wait for the ultimate redemption of Lana, a character who, from a kayfabe standpoint, has done the bare minimum to earn the approval of fans? Lana's babyface turn was weak and uninspired from the start, never fully justified, and with a big old whimper to close out the year. Number 12, Keith Lee's Whiplash year. After a great 2019, there were a lot of fans who felt that 2020 could have been Keith Lee's breakout year. Well, something surely felt broken at one point, yes. Lee had a terrific first half of the year, winning the North American Championship and snapping Adam Cole's historic reign with the NXT title, becoming the first guy to hold both at once. It was a great time for one of the most dynamic wrestlers in the company today. Lee may have scored a big win over Randy Orton soon after his call-up, but beyond that, there hasn't been much glory to bask in. Of the roughly 24 matches he's had on TV and pay-per-view, he's barely won a fourth of them clean, everything else ending in a DQ or a countout. Not a very dominant look. I don't get how this could be so difficult. Even if you ignore his work at NXT, how could you look at a guy like Keith Lee and not put him in a position to look good? It's like WWE only has enough energy and time to make one or two guys tops win the bulk of their matches. After that, fuck it, 50-50 time. Granted, he's only been on Raw for about a half year now, and anything could happen in the future. But after Lee's epic run at NXT, he's had somewhat of a crash landing since coming to Raw. Number 11, Rhea Ripley's momentum killed. By the end of 2019, Rhea Ripley was a bona fide star. She had a unique look, she had a great presence in the ring, and she gave off an air of dominance. Her run to the top of NXT was really fun to watch. Then came Mania 36, challenging Charlotte Flair for a defense of her NXT Women's Championship. Rhea really could have used that win to cement her place, but instead, she was beaten and taken off TV for months while Charlotte did hardly anything to elevate the title. A real good decision there. Only until recently, it feels like Rhea lost a lot of the spark that made her so cool to watch. She's an entirely different performer than she was this time last year, and I would argue not for the better. WWE all but admitted to putting her through this intentionally as some sort of learning experience, but shouldn't they have gotten through that bullshit before the big title push? Number 10, AEW's Women's Division. After almost 2 years of running shows, one of AEW's biggest stumbling blocks remains the quality of and emphasis on their women's division, or a lack thereof. Sadly, a lot of the women's matches across programming can't compare to those of NXT or Impact, for example. Part of it has to do with the fact that COVID has made it hard for Joshi wrestlers to travel, and part of it's because a lot of the women they've signed still need seasoning. No matter who was champion, they were usually treated like afterthoughts, barely on TV, and their pay-per-view angles often rushed. Brandi Rhodes has been all over the place as a character and couldn't make anything stick. The woman they spent more time pushing on TV than any other couldn't even wrestle for half the year due to an assortment of injuries, but at least the skits were funny. And in case you want another example of how thin the women's roster is, they had to outsource the NWA Women's Champion for Shida to have a credible opponent on pay-per-view. AEW does have a diverse group of ladies on their roster, and with the recent additions of people like Serena Deeb and Thunder Rosa, there's a ton of upside there. But there's still a lot of work to be done, especially if they want to convince ladies to pay $50 a year to join their special fan club. Number 9, the Tessa Blanchard controversy. In January of last year, Tessa Blanchard beat Sami Callihan to become the first female world champion in Impact Wrestling history. It was an historic moment that validated a lot of people who support intergender wrestling, but that moment was obscured by a dark cloud of controversy. In the days leading up to Hard to Kill, several female wrestlers came forward with accusations of bullying and racism from Tessa, many of which were backed by other people with knowledge of the situation, and in the case of a particularly nasty alleged incident in Japan, was confirmed by the victim. Instead of stepping out in front of the situation at the press events before and after the pay-per-view, Blanchard was conspicuous in her silence until she finally issued a statement on Twitter denying the allegations. Tessa was eventually let go from Impact and had her title taken away from her after contract talks had stalled. Her talent makes her one of the hottest free agents in wrestling, but those accusations, along with an earlier reputation of bad behavior backstage, has seemingly made her persona non grata in the wrestling world. What was meant to be a great uplifting moment for women in wrestling turned sour, as Tessa's championship reign was tainted by the scandals of her past. Did she deserve it? Was it all really true? We may never know the answers, though perhaps if she didn't post a tweet telling female wrestlers to support each other, she might not have opened herself up to that criticism. Number 8, Goldberg beats the Fiend. Super Showdown, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. In a show that was otherwise not that memorable, the main event saw Goldberg destroy the Fiend Bray Wyatt in less than 3 minutes to become the new Universal Champion. Yeah. Mark it down as one of the biggest never should have happened moments of the last 5 years, because this was just maddening. The Fiend's supposed to be evil incarnate, a final boss who should have all the momentum going into WrestleMania as some insurmountable hurdle of pain and destruction. Instead, he's wasted by a part-timer who he never interacts with again. Of all the people WWE could have used as a transitional champion from Seth Rollins to Goldberg, surely they could have used anyone else and it would have made a lot more sense. And in the end, it served little to no purpose. Bray didn't need the belt that early. Goldberg didn't need the belt at all. He only held it for a few weeks. He didn't even drop it to the guy they wanted him to drop it to after Roman Reigns bailed. And despite losing the biggest prize on SmackDown, Bray kept on going like it didn't even matter. If that's how he perceives it on TV, why should we feel any different? Bray would recover by the end of the year with a pretty cool feud with Randy Orton that saw a dummy in his image get burned to a crisp on pay-per-view, so at least he stayed relevant. But that early loss to Goldberg did not help with his mystique and ended up meaning almost nothing. Yowie wowie indeed. Number 7. Matt Hardy's nasty fall. As I've mentioned before, there are a lot of things creatively that AEW is doing well, but when it comes to the health and safety of their wrestlers, and the occasional animal, they still have a lot to learn. At the All Out pay-per-view, Matt Hardy and Sammy Guevara waged war in a broken rules match, but only a couple of minutes in, Hardy was the only one who was broken after taking a big bump off a hydraulic lift and overshooting the tables he was supposed to land on. The back of his head slammed into the concrete and Hardy was K'd the F.O. Now, in that split decision moment, AEW should have stopped the match just to be safe, and for a second, they did. But not only did they undo stopping the match, Matt Hardy finished it to completion. I cannot stress enough just how wrong that move was. Look, when you're knocked out like Hardy was, when you stop moving for a few seconds and can barely get back to your feet like he did, I'm sorry, that's a concussion, plain and simple, and the match should have been stopped. And if you don't agree with me, the humble YouTube nerd, you can talk to Dr. Christopher Nowinski on the matter, because that's exactly the kind of stuff he said in the seminar I attended earlier in the year. AEW made a bad call here. Tony Khan can say all he wants that Hardy got a clean CT scan and didn't get diagnosed with a concussion, but if that's the case, why'd they wait 2 months for him to wrestle again, and then he had to make an announcement that he was fully recovered from this injury he supposedly didn't have? Matt's injury is the most egregious example of a lack of immediate wrestler care in AEW. We've seen similar inaction happen for guys like Alex Reynolds and Rey Fenix, among others. They say they've learned from the Hardy experience and have put in a new concussion protocol, which again feels like an admission of guilt. Let's hope they never have to use it, but if they do it well. Number 6. Tribes still be trippin'. It's something I brought up in last year's Worst of Countdown that sadly still applies today. In this new war of wrestling promotions, some fans have chosen to pick sides and are going to ride with them till the wheels fall off no matter what, and that's led to some fun interactions on social media. Mention anything positive about a company and suddenly you're a fanboy or a paid shill. Mention something negative and you want to see the company fail or you're a stand for the other side. Folks, if I said it once, I've said it 100 times. We don't need to pick sides in wrestling. There is way too much going on in wrestling these days to be forced to pick a side or waste time arguing with people whose opinions might be different than yours. Wrestling is a veritable buffet of styles and presentations spanning decades. The key is to enjoy what you want to enjoy and not to be rude toward others for what they enjoy. You know, I like that sentiment. If only there were a cooler, snappier way to get that point across. Number 5. Retribution. What happens when somebody dares Vince McMahon to ruin a new stable worse than the Nexus? You get Retribution. Debuting on the same night as Raw Underground, we began seeing a group of people in all black, destroying property outside and inside the Performance Center for weeks. Then after a few weeks, this evil group that was assaulting workers and destroying property got signed by the company? And then they were given permission to do whatever they wanted, and nothing really happened with that, and they just kind of stopped being a big deal? Mercedes Martinez was there for like 2 weeks? They took a group of NXT talent and put them in some half-assed face paint and masks and changed their name and put them in this group that was supposed to be the single biggest threat to the company's entire existence. Then they were destroyed by the Hurt Business in their first match and have never recovered. What the hell kind of lack of follow-through was this crap storyline? You just know they did it at first because they wanted to get the shock from it, then didn't know what to do with it next before they got bored with it, but not before adding Mustafa Ali as its leader. The whole thing is easily the dumbest storyline all year, and it all but ruined the potential of a half-dozen superstars for literally no reason. Number 4. WWE versus third-party platforms. Every once in a while, let's just say every day, I am gobsmacked over how WWE can refer to its wrestlers as independent contractors and get away with it, especially after hearing stories like this. The company decided to crack down on wrestlers making money from third-party platforms like Twitch, Cameo, or YouTube. The new rule is the wrestlers have to share their profits with the McMahons or not engage in extracurriculars at all. Oh, and while I'm here, it makes so much sense for the wrestlers to capitalize on these platforms. It's great marketing for themselves and for WWE. They have time to do it since they're not exactly on the road, there's no wear on their bodies, and they can get paid. But Vince was like, I'll be taking some of that please, as if I need it, and by the way, still not giving you health insurance. What a crock of shit. I mean, I can understand wanting to make some money off the stars they created, but I feel WWE is overstepping their bounds here. As independent contractors, these workers have the right to make money off this independent work. I mean, it's in the name. Many of the wrestlers have stopped streaming entirely as a result of this new order. Zelina Vega was not only the most outspoken against the new ban, but she defied the order by setting up an OnlyFans account, advertising pics of cosplay and swimsuits and lingerie, and predictably, that got her fired. The silver lining of this latest blatant example of WWE abusing their workforce is that it did pick up some steam from people in the real world who understand how labor laws work, like former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Hopefully this nonsense can get the ball rolling on some real protections for the workers, which would be especially nice when they eventually get back on the road someday. Boy, I hope nothing else bad happened to the wrestlers this year. Number 3. The WWE Pandemic Releases. Son of a bitch. You might have heard me rant about this when the story first broke in the spring, when dozens of wrestlers and producers were suddenly given the axe. They said it was done for budget reasons in response to the pandemic, but the company still makes a stupid amount of money. In fact, the same quarter where they fired all those wrestlers was one of their most financially successful to date. Oh man, they were really in trouble, folks. Now you could argue, well, a lot of the wrestlers who did get cut weren't on TV much or anything, and we always complain about how bloated the roster is and how all these wrestlers are being wasted, so it was a blessing in disguise, right? Maybe for the handful of guys and gals who got signed to Impact or AEW or ROH right away, but these companies are going through a lot of the same weird stuff WWE is right now. It's not like there's a ton of job openings available. Not all of those wrestlers are able or willing to wrestle in the pandemic. Not all of them have side money coming from Twitch either. And if they're not wrestling, how easy it is for them to find other work right now. Since the pandemic first escalated here in America in March, WWE remains the only company to have cut that many wrestlers on that kind of scale. And those other companies I mentioned don't have nearly the capital or infrastructure that WWE does. So what's Vince McMahon's excuse? It's been a hard year for everyone, but in strange circumstances like these, a company that truly cared about its workers would try and keep things stable for them while we all ride out the storm together. And taking some of their revenue and firing a lot of them seems like the opposite of that. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot to mention they turned Drake Maverick's firing into an angle and it ended with him getting his job back. What the hell, guys? Number 2. Wrestlers gone too soon. The wrestling world lost a lot of big names this past year. Bob Armstrong, Kamala, Road Warrior Animal, Tracy Smothers, and Pat Patterson, just to name a few. Most of those we lost in 2020 were men who lived full lives, passing from natural causes. But there were 3 deaths in particular that hit the community hard. In May, 22-year-old Hana Kimura of Stardom took her own life after being the victim of online bullying from viewers of her reality TV exploits in Japan. It was an example of the toxicity that persists on social media and its very real consequences. The Joshi star's death serves as a reminder that we should all try and be a little nicer to each other, though sadly there are some out there in internet land who have chosen to use her as a shield against justified criticism. Less than 1 week later, former WWE star Shad Gaspard tragically passed in the waters of Venice Beach after working to save his own son from being lost in the waves. Shad's child survived, and his act of selflessness ultimately cost him his own life at 39 years of age. And as one final gut punch to close out the year, AEW star Brody Lee suddenly passed the day after Christmas at the age of 41 due to a non-COVID related lung condition. His death took place in the same year that he debuted for the company as the leader of the Dark Order and beat Cody Rhodes to the TNT Championship. Had he stayed healthy, who knows how much farther he could have gone in his career. Like Hana and Shad, Brody's death led to a near universal outpouring of support. Countless stories of his kindness and love of his family have burst forth in the wake of his passing, peaking with a touching tribute show in his honor the following Wednesday on Dynamite. His life was one of many taken from us far too soon in a year that was already defined by sadness and grief. And the worst thing about wrestling in 2020 was the fallout of speaking out. When the Me Too movement first made waves 5 or 6 years ago, I was kind of surprised that pro wrestling didn't have its moment of reckoning. Sadly, there are a lot of shady people in wrestling, some more overt than others, and I thought it was only a matter of time before stories began to pour out. Those stories of victims coming out seemed few and far between until this past year, when one by one, several people in the British wrestling scene were outed as alleged abusers, groomers, pedophiles, rapists, and so forth. That eventually made its way across the pond in America, where a lot of wrestlers here were also implicated in similar accusations. And it wasn't just an indie wrestling thing. Every major company in this country had ties with at least one wrestler who was implicated. Some of those relationships were severed, while others, sadly, are still ongoing. These accusations and reports rocked the wrestling community. Many of those who were named had large followings and loyal fan bases who now felt betrayed and disappointed by someone they previously looked up to. I was somebody who was betrayed and disappointed by a lot of people. Not to mention these accusations meant the end of some wrestling organizations entirely. I've spoken at length before about this topic and the struggle that victims have in coming forward because of the risk of public backlash, and I remain firm in what I said then. People in the wrestling business need to listen to victims and take every allegation of abuse seriously. The business needs to grow and evolve by removing these toxic elements that give the industry a bad name. In a way, speaking out wasn't just a negative thing, but a positive one as well, as it helped many locker rooms do just that. Everyone in wrestling, man or woman, fan or worker or crew member, deserves to feel safe around their peers. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good people in wrestling, a lot of good people. But there's also a dark underbelly that's gone on for far too long. And the silver lining of speaking out, if you want to call it that, is that it's finally being addressed. Well, there you have it. My picks for the best and the worst of wrestling in 2020 in a nutshell. There were some good moments, don't get me wrong, but overall, thank God it's over. May 2021 be a little bit better for all of us, and may we all see each other again at wrestling shows very soon. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.